I'm really thrilled that we had a chance to start our day today with the conversation between Elżbieta and Krzysztof. I think this was a very good start of our thinking about yet another chapter of our thinking of making home in wounded places. Two things that Krzysztof mentioned: this notion of a space that is pregnant with opportunities and with possibilities, and the fact that the best bridge builders are those who are on site, in the place that is in need of building bridge. I thought it was a very nice bridging to our panel that we're just about to have. We're very happy to have you all here with us, but it will be slightly different take on what was happening yesterday. So we're really very much looking forward to what's going to happen. Otto van Busch is our moderator, who generously agreed to moderate this panel, and he is also an intellectual and design-oriented bridge builder in one way or another. He is an associate professor of integrated design at Parsons. As you might know, his scholarly interests revolves around fashion and hacking practices, and most recently fashion and bullying. He just came back from the UK, which is yet another reason to be grateful that you're here with us. Please join me in welcoming the new panel. Otto, the mic is yours.
Hello. Thank you everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for housing our guests here for the panel. So, yes, exactly. We will have 4 presentations on design in wounded places, and I was just going to sort of start off with a little sort of teaser of some sorts, to sort of thinking about. Was I going to move something? Yes. Oh, whatever. Because of course, design has sort of this dilemma about sort of what to do with the wound, and sort of Elaine Scarry's introduction, in a sense, to design is also that design is always dealing with pain. In a sense, design is always something tries to alleviate pain somehow, and of course, coming from the world of fashion, that is not. Oops, that's not really what we do in fashion design. No pain, no gain, we say, etc. So there's a little designers. We don't really deal with users. Designers is more about overcoming the user and sort of producing a situation where my ego is so big that you will just want to sort of buy into what I'm supposed to help you with, in a sense. So we never do user studies or listens to participants and this kind of stuff. There's no channel to call in to Karl Lagerfeld and say, oh, we want more red next season. There's no such thing. So to us, it's sort of a dilemma, in a sense, trying to understand what to do with the wound and what to do with people that are not sort of like us, in a sense. And I think this is a little what we can sort of try to sort of figure out or start to deal with here, in a sense of how can designers engage with the wounded places, engage with the wound and pain and suffering. And to me, I think, starting with Krzysztof Wojcik's work, I think sort of from the 80s and 90s is a starting point for many designers today that sort of engage with sort of critical design, speculative, whatever we want to call it, but trying to sort of deal with social issues, in a sense, where design is not only, of course, coming from a tradition of Victor Papanek and others, and of course you can sort of stretch the history of much design backwards to every design school, in a sense, tries to deal with the issues of its time. But I think what Wojcik was really trying to figure out was ways to sort of work in the world as designers, not sort of from the top down, in a sense. So his homeless vehicles were, of course, one way to sort of start thinking about engagement with the people who were not usually the users, the people who were not part of the economy, etc., etc. And just 3 years ago, he made just here on Union Square, a few blocks away, he made the war veteran projection onto the Lincoln statue, where he was projecting witness statements from various American war veterans onto the heroic figure of Lincoln. And so in the night, there would be these interviews with people enacted onto this sort of heroic war memorial, in a sense, over the glory of American victories. And here came sort of the suffering and the voices of the veterans onto this character that then sort of started speaking and was animated at night. So this is one way of sort of thinking about what are these voices and who hears these voices, who speaks these voices, and who on what monuments, what platforms are they allowed to bear witness, in a sense. Of course, you can also say that, I mean, compared to the homeless vehicle, this is also a little more defensive, perhaps. You know, it's also a piece that doesn't really dive into the issue. It's quite comfortable sort of projecting it onto Lincoln, in a sense, and letting these voices speak there, but at the same time not actually having to deal with the really nitty-grittiness of dealing with people who are wounded, in a sense. Martin Avila, a Swedish interaction designer, has tried to sort of figure out a lot of these kind of design prepositions, in the sense of, you know, how are we designing for things or over things, above things? How are designers engaging with all these different prepositions, which we in a sense sort of usually take for granted that either we have a voice for something or we work on a topic, etc. You know, but what does it really mean to lean against subjects? So what other prepositions could we think about designers to try to sort of come in orbit almost around problems and around issues to better sort of feel out which preposition is actually best for this situation for us to work with. And I think this comes back to the dealing with the wounded places, I think. And this is something that resonates through a lot of my work. And it is the question of immunity versus community, where, of course, someone like Roberto Esposito has worked a lot on this, but I think the question there is that we as designers are totally sort of steeped in the modernist tradition where it is automatically for immunity that we are always designing for, you know. We are building doors that are opening automatically. We are building buses that sort of go down so I can easily access it. Everything is designed so that I would never need to ask for help, you know. The telephone says if its grandmother is calling, and I know grandma is in a bad mood, so I can actually not have to answer, etc. You know? So, you know, it's everything so that it's, you know, transferred the decision to me, so I actually don't really have to confront the world. The whole idea of of design is actually to make me more and more immune, rather than actually that I have to deal with the sort of the bridge and the troubles of negotiation and conflicts that everyday life is full of. And I think this is kind of confidence that is perhaps the big dilemma for design, in a sense. How are we, if we are sort of steeped in a tradition, as Helene Scarry says, that to take away the wound, to take away the pain, well, are we also producing a situation where we cannot no longer actually deal with pain, and we are taking away the interfaces by which we could meet the other and overcome differences and so on. And I think the presentations today are trying to address these issues and look at the different prepositions, in a sense, of how we can engage. You know, can we engage in and out, by the side, above? How do we move around the issue of the wound? We'll see. But thank you. Yes, and we will have discussions and such afterwards.
Thank you very much for having me here. This is the first presentation of this PhD project, which started this September in the University of Göteborg and Academy of Design and Crafts, HDK. And it's really important to say that because it's Sweden, and Sweden has another tradition on seeing things and doing things. So all the presentation and all the material you will see today is work in progress. First of all, I would like to take you to the general idea of the project. So the working title of the project is Children Let's Play, Design Explorations, Refugee Children and Playful Learning in Transit and Refugee Camps Settings. I consider the project as an interaction of three fields: design, politics, and learning. Having as a starting point children's play, I'm investigating how play and playful activities can become the medium for children in transit settings to develop further their individual and social capabilities in relation to these specific social and cultural settings. Does play have the potential to become the design material for children and designers, so can both reconfigure new acts as Clive has proposed? The project is referring to play and the material forms of it as the primary base of creativity, as Modago has argued, as an integral part of mental development and learning, as Flanagan has already pointed out, and as a separation from reality, either through a sanctioned play space or through an agreed-upon fantasy or rule set, as Pellegrini and Smith argues. Play can be an individual or a social act with or without structure or toys. Sutton Smith argues that play activities may be grouped in 4 categories: play as learning, play as power, play as fantasy, and play as itself. I will not go further with learning kind of concepts and so on. I will just let you a hint about that I'm start digging, and with the support of the department, into critical pedagogy and so on, and informal learning and settings and so on. So just to mention that the overall research question is in what conditions and in what ways may playful design exploration be shaped with migrant or refugee children to support their own identity and cultural futures at the new locations. The idea is to explore this through 2 study cases. One in an emergency reception site, which I will refer from now on as a camp in the North Greece, and one in an asylum reception site in Scandinavia. Still, we haven't defined where it will be, if it will be Norway or Sweden. This is some photos I have taken last summer from the abandoned camp in the borders of Greece, in Idomeni. You probably have heard that in media. Now I will take you to the Greek context, because this is the first thing or I and all the other people that do research are facing. You have to allow me to say that last week I entered the center of the world. I briefly visited a reception center in Greece, in my hometown of Thessaloniki, the Softex camp. For people that probably doesn't have heard or know about Thessaloniki, Thessaloniki has been it's the 2nd biggest city in Greece, and it has been always the most multicultural city through ancient and modern Greek. We have this quote that it says that no one should be homeless as long as Thessaloniki exists. Just to point out, like in 1913, when Thessaloniki became Greek in the Balkan Wars, the population was 39% Jewish, 29% Muslims, 25% Greek Orthodox, 40% Bulgarian Orthodox, 2% Armenians, and 1% others. So, and I say that because Thessaloniki is overloaded through the history of this kind of situations. Thessaloniki has been a central passage for the refugee the last years, as it is located in one of the 2 main routes to Central Europe for the people coming from Turkey, both from above, from the mainland, but also from the islands. Thessaloniki at this moment has 10 to 15 structures for refugees, and the number varies as the political decisions are changing all the time. The quality of the structures also varies, from old factories to abandoned army camps, which none of these have been designed to accommodate people, neither for short or long-term accommodation. Just to let you know, there is a lot of, the Hellenic Center for Disease Control and Prevention back in the beginning of the summer of 2016, called for the closure of reception centers for migrants across the country as they were inadequate and posed health risks for both the migrants and the general public. Still, the Greek government, in the spring of 2016, after the whole international press, decided to use any kind of available site, like disused military barracks or industrial sites, in order to gather refugees who were stranded in the islands and mainland after the agreement between Europe and Turkey, where it was like, now we stop, no one is coming over. And they gave also money to Turkey to keep people there. So talking about wounded spaces. Softex. Softex is that little dot there. Softex was a paper towel factory which declared bankruptcy in the start of 2016. It is a historical company and really close to the Greek collective consciousness, due to the workers fighting and logs striking to keep the production and the factory running through the last years of the economic crisis in Greece. Softex is located in the west industrial area of the city. It's the area that no one wants to live, and it's the area where only Roma gypsies live. Its closest neighbor is the Hellenic petroleum refinery. The reception center has taken in use a big semi-finished warehouse and its gritty and dusty surroundings around that. A small stream, if I go back, there is a small stream somewhere there that divides the camp, the refinery. My visit at Softex was after the last attempts of United Nations to move people out of the tents and to relocate them in containers in the same place. Or to relocate them in hotels. The camp wasn't, let me just show you. You see that? This is the official statistics. The camp wasn't overpopulated, and only a few tents were standing inside the warehouse when I came, and that was for single men or people that there was no family in the tents. The families were moved in containers. I learned during that visit that the containers had only electrical and air heaters, no air conditioning. Since the summer have been mostly responsible. The NGO Save the Children have different kind of programs for activities and kids and basic courses in mother languages, cultural activities like theaters, and many volunteers go there and do activities with kids. My conduct mentioned an unclear number of children that day, around 50, with 25 preschoolers, 20 early school aides, and 5 in high school aides. And they stopped count the children in the age of 16. And that is very consciously, and this is very kind of EU has say that you stop counting children when they arrive in the age of 16. Numbers change every day. People are moving out in the camp and coming back. The Greek government has, since the start of the school year in September, established the program of reception structures for the refugee, namely school for all the children registered in Greece as refugees, as asylum seekers, or in waiting status to be relocated in the rest of Europe. The program is a collaboration. If you see that poster up there, I can just zoom. It's a collaboration between European Union, who is finance the program, Greek Minister of Education, who puts the human resources and the infrastructures, and the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, that it has responsibility for the transportation of the kids from the camps to the schools and back. The program offers a 6-hour educational program based in the Greek school curriculum for all the kids in primary and secondary level. The children are joining school at the afternoons because the Greek fellow pupil, or the Greek system, or the infrastructures are not enough, as they say that. In many cases, the program has not always been well accepted by local politicians, groups, and citizens. Maybe you have seen in the media neo-fascistic supporters tying up in front of schools, throwing food to bad food and things on the refugee children while going inside. So it's not always a very welcomed program. On the other hand, in many other schools, it's really a celebration. In Softex, of the day of my visit was 20 children that they were coming on the bus to go to school. It was that time of the day. Another interesting point here is that the teachers involved to the program are either part-time substitute teachers, that they are paid from European Union with specific kind of amount. Yeah, maybe I should just move on. And then some other regular positions that they are the coordinators. Now, I will raise up some issues. Yeah, this is how it has happened. Yeah, through 2 anecdotes. Anecdote 1. While I was touring around the camp, my conduct had to solve an immediate crisis. 2 women and a boy were going around asking and begging to come back in the camp. Afterwards, I was told that the 2 families with 4 children in total, 2 weeks ago, had accepted an offer from a Spanish NGO to move away from the camp. The NGO would offer them a prepaid house, and the people will have to support themselves by getting some small jobs around. The reality turned really bad as the families were placed in a remote village outside Thessaloniki, where there was no jobs, no social life, and no urban center. They were trapped in a warm house with hot water and nothing else. The moment they unregistered from the camp, they lost any kind of aid. Food, health, education, the monthly allowance from the United Nations. Same time, the NGO ceased to exist. So these people were going around asking the aid workers to help them register again in the camp. The army refused to do that. Not until the officer, who was pretty compassionate, asked some aid workers to take responsibility for these 2 families. Responsibility that they will return to the camp, that the children will join the school, and that they will accept the 3 registered meals per day. My conduct took the responsibility. Besides the warning from another aid worker who was speaking Arabic that the families will never come back. And the families re-registered at the end and gained access to the camp's benefits. My conduct also, she was counting 3 more children for her program. So it was really a win-to-win situation here. Because if she doesn't have kids, the program will stop from the government. Next day, my conduct told me that the kids didn't catch the bus for school. Anecdote 2. When I first met with my conduct in front of the camp's gate, the under-commander stopped us and started a conversation with us. He was curious about, what do you teach to these children? Do they learn anything in the school? And in which language do you teach them, as they do not speak Greek? A non-Greek observant would think that was a normal inquiry. For a native, though, the dialogue immediately became a show of power. Almost an action of bullying to the teacher or to the responsible of the project. For a native also, it's very clear that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Education, they don't have a common policy for the refugees. And that results to such tensions between officers and sometimes also in sabotaging each other's work. And I'm finishing now. through, this is kind of the situation that we heard in the first story, what is happening. Through these two events, it is very clear to me as a newly design researcher that before any kind of design activities, I have to unpack the highly complicated construction of the camp. When you make research about current events, there is a catch. Events change. It is not only about the population that it lives into these camps, but also the transit zones. They are changing organizational. For Keservas, any kind of encampments on various scales are a system of mental and material control over the time and space of their lives. A form of management of their moments, stories, narratives, memories, histories, bodies, and activities, which are transformed into fear, distrust, precarity, and vulnerability. I argue that Softex and all the rest of structures in Greece are such systems. Keservas also analyzed further the implication that these encampments have to people by drawing on Arendt's concept of spontaneity and action. They both claim that to destroy spontaneity means to take away the capacity for action, resistance, and meaning made by human beings. And this is exactly where I propose that children play maybe is a hidden, a forgotten by the oppressor's action of human beings that can serve as a springboard for agency, resistance, and meaning-making in these wooded spaces that these children live in. I argue that it is in the materiality of play within the wooded spaces that can unfold that quality of play, which is, of course, in need for further investigation. And I will let you on with this photo from Idomeni after they had demolished the camp there in the borders between Greece and Finland. Thank you.
I changed the title a little bit. I realized as I was writing that the thing I was really interested in and that I've been thinking a lot about is how I still talk about these things: aesthetic evangelism, solidarity, resistance, resilience, all these sorts of things. But I'm thinking about how we can form relationships, how artists and designers can form relationships with the people that they work with. And my research is primarily with social practice artists, and I'm wondering if some of the things I'm seeing there in the art world, in the social practice, also carries over into design. And I haven't talked to many designers yet, but I hope to do that as the research continues. And these are just some of the ways that the artists have been talking about their relationships with the people that they work with. And it's quite a range, and when pressed on some of these terms, there's a lot of discomfort, and I want to think about that kind of uncomfortableness and how we can move from being helpers to being more allies. And or maybe the question is if that's even something that's possible, and what kinds of conditions we would need to be able to do that. And I wanted to start with this example, although I know it's criticized all the time. I wanted to just look at it again and think about the life straw and how this image in particular tells us something about the way that the designers of that artifact think about their relationship with the users or the people that they design for. And this woman, kind of hunched over, a woman of color, hunched over the stream, with this phallus, that you need to kind of suck on this for 20 minutes a day or something like that to get the amount of water that you would need to be hydrated. And I wonder if we were to have some sort of a water crisis in a place like New York, is this the kind of design intervention that we would see? Can you imagine like a bunch of New Yorkers at the East River, all with their life straws, like bent over? And I don't think so. Maybe, but I don't know. And this was used for the cover of the catalog at the Cooper Hewitt when they had this show designed for the other 90%. And I think that this 4, to go back to what Otto was saying, in terms of how we position ourselves, the 4 is really important. Although I noticed that it was changed in the next iteration of the exhibition to with, which was important. Nice. So I want to think about this idea of doing good as something in itself that's beyond reproach, right? And I think we need to challenge it if designers are to develop relationships capable of questioning larger structural issues and inequalities. I know that there's this focus now on humility and an increasing emphasis on the importance of empathy in design. But I wonder, what we can get from empathy. I feel like at every turn we're being asked to embody these situations where we're meant to somehow feel some sort of empathy for others, right? So I went to an exhibition at the Historical Society where you could pick up a bucket and carry it across the gallery. It was an exhibition about slavery, and it was meant to have you feel, what it was like to be a slave and to carry water. And I thought, carrying this bucket, and it didn't really feel like that. Or I went to this refugee camp in the city, sponsored by Doctors Without Border, and they asked us, as a group to experience what it's like to flee violence and hunger and this sort of thing. And again, you didn't really experience it, although this boy did, and at some point he had this empathy for the children who've been separated from their parents. This woman was a doctor who's worked in various refugee situations, and she was explaining how children are often separated from their parents, never reunited, and he became very upset, and he was crying, and immediately everyone on the tour, rushed to him, and they said, no, that can't happen here, and it can't happen to you, and was this interesting moment. And I'm thinking about other things, kind of the spectacle, too, where here you have Vanessa Beecroft, the artist, working with Kanye West on his fashion line and album release, and she was the art director. She told these models here to channel poverty. She gave them keywords: poverty, classical, and elegance, and she asked them to channel a Rwandan refugee camp. So maybe you feel the camp here, I don't know. Or thinking about, if you're lucky enough or rich enough, maybe you go to the World Economic Forum, and you can participate in these events where, this is from 2017, but this is an image from 2014 where for an hour and a half you have this experience of a Syrian refugee camp, and Sheryl Sandberg was here in this one. So people get this chance to experience something that they don't have that opportunity, in their real life. So they can do it. They can do it here. Another example, and I'll stop. I have so many of these though, in an archive. This is from an event in Berlin, a film, the Cinema for Peace Gala, where Ai Weiwei distributed these blankets to the people at the gala, and then they were taking all these selfies and photos of, of this. And part of the installation too, he brought in all these life jackets, the actual, authentic life jackets worn by refugees, and this. And so I guess I'm wondering what we can accomplish through empathy, and design's really pushing this empathy agenda. Can I say that? It sounds bad. But I mean, can it help us move from caring about something, as a sentiment, to caring for something as an action? We see it in the art world too. this is a project, Brendan Fernandez, it's called Clean Labor, where they've followed around cleaning women and made some sort of dance about their gestures. And I just wonder what these things actually do and if there's something else here. And in her book On Revolution, Hannah Arendt discusses how the privileged often attribute their advantaged position to luck, understanding those as less fortunate just simply as unlucky. And when you frame it this way, she argues, the privileged can avoid reckoning with the fact that this is less about luck and obviously more about how human actions are the forces that create these conditions of war, famine, violence, pollution, scarcity of resources, and opportunity. And in this formulation, the lucky and the privileged feel pity for the unlucky and the exploited, and they're kind of attracted to these unlucky souls because they want to help, right? But pity is the sentiment, and she talks about solidarity as something very different, something that can guide action. While pity deprives people of their public political identity, she says it's only out of solidarity that communities of interest can be deliberately and dispassionately established so that people can act and speak politically. And certainly we see this too in art and design. We have, the decolonized art, decolonized design, this sort of thing, looking at art washing and, being very critical of that. And we have a lot of these toolkits that I want to think about too. And what does it mean to have a toolkit, and what kinds of relationships might you establish when you're using, a toolkit for revolution, a toolkit for collective action. I don't know, we have a little book of design research ethics, a little book. So I wonder what we do with all of this. And I do think that the way that ethnography is being used in design is one move toward thinking about this, right? How can we be more reflexive and think about our relationships with people as a designer? Are you working for people? Are you working with people? More toolkits, some with ethnography. When we go to a wounded place, or we think about people who inhabit these places, are we assuming that there's some kind of anomie, that there's a loss of civility, that there's a breakdown of social ties, and what do we assume that what we encounter there are people and places at risk? And this idea of risk as something that we can calculate and that we can govern is one of the things that's kind of led us, I think, into this way of working that's based in resilience. And I think I'm very attuned to this. I used to be a social worker, and the resilience model was very strong in social work. Instead of changing the conditions in which the young people I worked with lived, it was more about how can we make them resilient so that they can somehow withstand these conditions, and we'll just leave them there in place. So there was a New York Times article recently, I don't know if you saw it, about resilience. And they argue that while resilience can suggest new avenues for civic infrastructure, admitting that disaster can't always be diverted, it's indistinguishable from classic American bootstrap logic when it's applied to individuals, placing all the burden of success and failure on a person's character. So, where resilience does shift the discourse, I think it still leaves the individuals are the ones who have to bear the burden of reform. And it somehow doesn't fix the underlying causes. It's just there addressing these symptoms. So I'd like to hear more. I hope we have time to talk about how people feel about resilience. And this is the model from the Rockefeller Center about resilience, and it looks somehow oddly like the Bauhaus curriculum model to me. And maybe I'm stretching it on that point, but so a recent sociological study drawing from ethnographic research found that creative campaigns are largely ineffective in including input from the participants they engage. The research showed a tendency to silence in the name of politeness, confrontational activism, or people who express themselves in ways that don't mesh with the communication styles of the professionals who lead these projects. They also found that there was this entrepreneurial spirit where the projects would align themselves more with the private sector logic than with activist groups, or, you know, they were more, you know, fitting nicely with these innovators or models of innovation and not with these more grassroots sorts of projects, right? And the study concluded that these projects fail when they're agnostic about outcomes, when they reify privilege, and when they discourage dissent and raw emotion. And they found that most of the projects they looked at, in fact, did those very things. And it got me thinking about Grant Kester's conversation about aesthetic evangelism, right? And he talks about how when artists go into these public projects, socially engaged projects, and they're trying to help, they're always somehow distanced from the people they're working with. And again, he brings up this notion of the prepositions and how this comes into play. And he's drawing a lot here from this idea from Bourdieu about the delegate, right? And what Bourdieu says is that the more people are dispossessed, above all culturally, the more they're constrained and inclined to put themselves into the hands of representatives in order to have a political voice. So they transfer the power, and he argues that that transfer of power is very violent in a symbolic way. And this role of being the delegate is taken on in good faith, and, you know, with this, again, this idea that people want to help. But there's something, you know, this relationship can start to be kind of strange because you, in lots of cases, allegorize the people that you're working with, right? And Bourdieu talks about these, you know, those images we're probably familiar with from murals and things, with the very noble working class person, you know, kind of looking ahead, very strong. And, you know, instead of seeing actual people, you see this imagery of people. And I think we see that too with images of, you know, people in the, well, you know, the inner city. Now we talk about that again with Trump, but, or, you know, people in faraway places who are hungry or whatever it might be, you know, kind of these versions of a people instead of actual, you know, actual people. So I want to propose something, and I'm, again, curious to hear what people think, that, you know, we talk all the time about the merging of art and life, and I mean, I remember reading when Occupy Wall Street happened, people were saying, wow, you know, I walked into Zuccotti Park and I felt like I was in an art installation, so kind of this fuzziness here. And a lot of the projects that I'm writing about in my current research occupy this kind of double ontological status, where they are the thing that they claim to be, but they're also an art project, so they're not really that thing. And as such, the way that people relate in these situations is somehow altered, or at least there's a potential that this can happen. And these are things like a think tank that is a think tank but isn't. It's, you know, an art project, or a garage sale, or a Spanish language bookstore. So they have this, I think that they change the way people interact. And I wonder if we can't take something from that and kind of move it into design and see if something can be learned there. Is there something we can kind of take advantage of in reworking the situation? And we have also, I lost my place. I started talking, and now I want to go back to reading, and I don't know how to find it. So in The Emancipated Spectator, Rancière talks about when he's a young researcher, he has this goal of figuring out how the worker and the scholar can somehow come together, right? Because he says, we all knew there was this gap between their experiences. And so he goes into the archives and he starts reading letters that workers were writing to each other. And he realizes, oh, these letters sound just like the letters that I see from philosophers and scholars, that they're writing to each other. Maybe we've just framed this wrongly, and that there's not really a gap here after all that we have to bridge in order to have these conversations. So, he works with that idea throughout the text, and in some ways, and I don't know if these particular examples succeed or fail, but they do raise a lot of questions. In some ways, dealing with that gap is something like the Ghana think tank is doing when they do go to other places and ask, whether it's someone in a US prison or someone in Ghana, someone in Cuba, the various places where they go, they ask people, in these places to solve the problems in the so-called first world, privileged people. So they're flipping the script in some way. And then you have examples like Thomas Hirschhorn and the way he's trying to reconfigure the idea of a monument. And again, this project, has a lot of problems, but he is rethinking what does it mean to create a monument, something that's ephemeral, monumentalizing people who aren't normally, monumentalized. And I want to end, I guess, with, I skipped a lot of things. Does it make sense what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. And I heard about this project just last week, and as someone who doesn't know that much about World Heritage sites, I'd like to hear more from people here who do, and I know some of you do. And this is the Daisha refugee camp in Palestine, and a group, DAR, Decolonizing Architecture and Art Residency, has filed, an official form to declare the refugee camp a World Heritage Site. And I think there's something really interesting in doing that looks a little bit like these art projects, in that they're doing it, they're going through the official channels and they're doing it for real, but at the same time it's kind of a proposition, and they make these claims. They say things like, this is an attempt to imagine and practice refuginess beyond humanitarianism. They also say that this demands redefining the subject of the refugee itself as a being in exile, and understanding exile as a political practice of the present capable of challenging the status quo, right? So there's something in doing this. They've even hired this Italian photographer who was hired to take these official photos of actual World Heritage sites, and they've hired him to come in and take pictures, and so it exists in that same way as something, but as not that thing at the same time. And I wonder if we're able to do that, kind of leverage that, and somehow, even asking, what's a wounded place, looking at a so-called, unwounded or healthy place and saying, in what ways is this wounded? Or looking at a wounded place and saying, framing it differently. And then it occurred to me that this is a little bit like drag, and maybe because I went to see a lecture by this performance artist, Christine, last week, and I was writing this paper at the same time, and much of what Christine was talking about in doing drag was very similar to the ideas I had here. So maybe we could think of wounded places in drag and how that might change the conditions for other kinds of relationships to form. So that's it.
Good morning. Oops, this thing moves. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for chance to be here and to be back in New York after so many years. It's really quite wonderful. And really enjoyed the event up till now, and I'm sure I will in the future. Okay, now the title of my paper was Strangers in the House, and it was sort of pirated or stolen from a book of the same name by Palestinian writer Raja Shihada. But I think actually in the last couple of days I've rethought that, and it should really be called Strangers in the Home. The images that I'm going to do will sort of touch some of the content of the talk, but a little bit obliquely. They're really about sort of destruction of homes generally from both sides of the divide, and they will sort of come together with the talk in where they will. So my research really ongoing is there's an interest in how to explain something complex or a complex situation using something else, and in this case I think the home or the house is a good vehicle to allow that to happen. So in this paper I'm going to be addressing the tangled relationships between home, house, politics. And the home, supposedly a place liberated from fear and anxiety, untouched by social and political processes, a place enjoying an autonomous and independent existence. However, as Catherine Brickell has written in a paper that she wrote about doing critical geographies of home, the home is actually a vital space for understanding microgeographies of social and spatial uncertainty, which influence and are influenced by wider structural forces of unhomeliness, alienation, and homelessness. So in the quote that I started with, Gayasi links home and homeland, describing the shock felt by many, certainly in England, at the election of Donald Trump as United States President. And what she sort of described was, she related it to an airing of the dirty laundry of the home. And she said, and I quote, "Either many Americans did not know that the house was in disarray, or they knew but hoped that the disorder wouldn't get out and wouldn't be seen." It's not really for me to comment on your choice of American president. But the term lacking of introspection sort of comes to mind. Among other things. So I want to begin with a story which appeared in a British newspaper on the 4th of October 2005, and the context for this was the signing of the Oslo Accords between Israelis and Palestinians by the Rabin government around 10 years earlier than that. And in this agreement, the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C, creating a set of lines and boundaries, often invisible, but each with their own specific rules and regulations. So I'm just going to read out this story and then go from there. So it begins, before the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, Khalil Bashir's house was 20 meters from the Jewish settlement of Kfar Darom, an outpost of religious settlers. And when soldiers arrived in 2000 to commandeer his property, they wanted the family to leave the house altogether. But Mr. Bashir feared that if the family abandoned the property, it would be taken and destroyed, and so he refused to move. The soldiers then explained to Mr. Bashir the new geography of his home in terms he understood only too well. His three-story house was to be like the West Bank, the Israeli officer said, with its areas of divided security and administrative control. The army designated the living room as Area A, after that part of the occupied territories where the Palestinians have control, and told all three generations of the Bashirs, from 81-year-old Zana to her 5-year-old granddaughter, that they were confined there for most nights and sometimes for much of the day. It was the only part of the house they could still call their own. The bathroom, kitchen and bedrooms were Area B, where Palestinians administer themselves, but Israel has security control. In the Bashir home, that meant soldiers had priority, and the family had to ask permission to cook or go to the toilet. And then came Area C, where the Israeli military government runs everything and the Palestinians have no authority. The soldiers warned the Bashirs that all of their home above ground floor was Area C, and if they ventured up the stairs, they would be shot. The Israeli army then set up a machine gun post on the terraced roof, facing into Gaza's Deir al-Balah neighborhood, surrounded it with sandbags, barbed wire and camouflage netting, and took over the lives of Khalil and Suad Bashir and their 8 children. This is a different house because this occurs quite often. For the last few weeks, while the army prepared for the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, the family was confined to the living room day and night. Even the children had to knock on the door for permission to go to the toilet. Now, understanding micro conditions, this is a quote from Israeli architect Eyal Weissman, who's written some wonderful books on the architecture of the occupation, shall we say. Understanding micro conditions meant that we could speculate on their repetition and construct a larger picture on the macro level. End of quote. Micro conditions may also expose global issues that are relevant today, particularly in relation to security. The invasion of the house mirrors the wider political situation, not only in the physical arrangement of spaces, but also in the radically asymmetrical power relations between the two parties, their negotiating positions. Palestinian narrative, frozen in time, places the residents in a very weak, precarious position. Resemblance at micro and macro levels may primarily be found in issues of control. Occupation of the upper floors of the house mirrors the siting of settlements on the hilltops in the West Bank for surveillance, control and defense, and the ensuing fragmentation of Palestinian space is manifested in both home and the wider territory. The Bashir home is not separated into an inside and an outside, but has divisions imposed within the interior, which reflects measures applied in the wider political realm, which not only divide Palestine from Israel, but also divide Palestine from Palestine, cities from villages, preventing people from reaching their work, schools, and places of worship. In both house and territory, occupiers control the water supply, and in both places, restricted mobility and temporal dislocation are key tools, with doors in the house sort of representing or acting as checkpoints. Changes in the social and physical environment have great impact on the inhabitants, as they are unable to move while the occupiers can and do. Emergency measures applied over the territory have materialized in the home. People under occupation reside in an unsettled time defined by unpredictable events. I think one might also see a resemblance in the residents' refusal to leave, in their sort of determination to stay put. In the home, as in the occupied territories, maps and plans cannot record a situation that is rapidly changing. Walls and barriers that wrap around bits of territory are established and re-established, sometimes on a daily basis. Ever new, seemingly temporary acts maintain a constant state of conflict where every situation, in many cases, becomes negotiable. The apparent temporariness of such incursions actually allows the continuous and permanent nature of the occupation. And I think, above all, the discontinuous and fragmented nature of borders, in this case, demonstrates in a very, very real way the absolute impossibility, not to say stupidity, of attempting to the physical separation of the two peoples. Now, for an architect, if one uses the word house, the most immediate image that comes to mind is the exterior, the whole. An architecture that is solid and material with walls, windows, and a roof. Besides the front elevation, the drawing most commonly used to describe the house is the plan. Fundamental principle of this descriptive technique is division of internal space through the device of walls. The brief for the house for an architect is as good as given, as are the names applied to interior spaces. If, however, one accepts the word home, the brief is less well written. Home is a sequence of spaces, the hall, stairs, living room, and so on, but it's also understood as more than this. It is particular moments on our way, objects to which we attach meaning, familiar colours and smells, things without obvious function or reason, can involve different things for each occupant. These series of fragments are too complex to describe in architectural drawings. The writer Tim Ingold takes up these issues in the distinction that he makes between occupation and inhabitation. This is in his book about lines. He explains this as the difference between two knowledge systems. An occupant has a clear idea of boundaries, asserting mastery over an environment by viewing or drawing space from above without inhabiting it. An inhabitant, on the other hand, has a less certain engagement with place, paying constant attention to the layers of texture and materiality and building up detailed knowledge as lived experience. This suggests an ongoing struggle between two concepts. For the inhabitant, places of daily life are materially significant. Homes are known by their experience, maybe as simple as the place where you stop to tie your shoelaces. Places and memories are evoked not so much by the building as a whole and as an object seen from the outside, as by its components and furnishings. Places where personal belongings, clothes, books, photographs are kept. Writing about the films of Amos Gitaï, Irma Klein says the Hebrew language does not differentiate between house and home. She says the Hebrew word bayit means both, which thus effaces the boundary between inside and outside. I think this also applies to the Arabic word bayit, but I'm a little unclear on that. The distinction between the space enclosed by walls and its surroundings, earth, soil, landscape, whether urban or rural, she says, is lacking. And to quote, she says, in fact, one could locate the entire panoply of problems of the Zionist Israeli identities and their historical ideological perspectives in the tensions between notions of bayit, of house, home, and its extension into the concept of homeland. There's a wonderful little book by the Israeli novelist David Grossman called Writing in the Dark. And he says that one cannot talk of a home without mentioning its walls, the borders. In the 56 years of Israel's existence, he writes, there has not been a single decade during which the country had permanent and stable borders. And further on, he writes, the citizens of Israel have no clear concept of a border. Living in this way means living in a home where all the walls are constantly moving and open to invasion. A person whose home has no solid walls finds it very difficult to know where it ends and where the next home begins. The result of this ambiguity is that such a person's identity is always on the defense, always contra to those who threaten him. End of quote. To move slightly in a different area, because I'm trying to challenge some notions, particularly the notion of occupation. The earliest example of the Oxford English Dictionary of the use of the term occupation is the 13th century, in which it registers a sense of seizing, of taking possession, and employment, taking for one's use. It comes directly from the Latin occupatio. So occupation thus is a term within which illegitimacy lurks as a subtext, a term which, when appropriated by English, shifted its meaning from, one might say, placid domesticity in favour of its more unstable and violent antecedents. Occupation, being in the world, dwelling, are not statements of static conditions, as all have deep roots in action, instability, and impropriety. Occupation is getting up in the morning to make tea and finding a soldier in your kitchen making coffee, said Mrs. Bashir. Occupation is when I wanted to go to the toilet, a soldier had to go with me. I wasn't allowed in my bedroom. I looked in on my way to the toilet one day and there was a soldier with no clothes on in my bed. Occupation is experienced in the wider political realm with walls, fences, settlements, infrastructure, and other weapons. I seem to have missed out a little bit here. The work of the Palestinian artist, Mona Hatoum, displays a sort of uncertain engagement with home and objects suggested by Tim Ingold. Her work articulates the loss of familiar domestic environment. She was, of course, exiled from the Lebanon and couldn't return home. And she talks a lot about exile and the experience of exile. Ordinary objects which constitute a sense of home are disrupted, out of scale and out of place, revealing what is destroyed or missing. A doormat or prayer mat made of steel needles, which spell out the word welcome, is impossible to use. Seats, beds, floor coverings, and even sometimes the floors themselves are treacherous. One does not know where one stands. The house is occupied provisionally and in many cases precariously. And Edward Said has written about her work, familiarity and strangeness are locked together in the oddest way, adjacent and irreconcilable at the same time. For not only does one feel that one cannot return to the way things were, but there is also a sense of just how acceptable and normal these oddly distorted objects have become, just because they remain very close to what they've left behind. He says, Hatoum's work addresses not being at home in a place where one might have felt in place, at ease and at rest. It describes conditions by which home is reduced to being a mere house. So, occupation is experienced in the wider political realm, as I said, with walls, fences and settlements, infrastructure and other weapons. It's also encountered in the private places of homes and rooms with acts of enclosure, separation, and containment. People are under occupation forced to exist within two cultures. A second, usually alien culture, spread over the existing one as two geographies are imposed over the same territory. Confronting each other, these two cultures elicit different behavior and inhabit the same spaces in different ways. For the inhabitant, daily routines and activity are curtailed, molded, and adapted to the changed environment. For the occupier, energy and resources are expended on enforcing rules and regulations and maintaining a protective skin. So to return to Gayasi's statement, it suggests, suggests a tangled relationship between homes and homeland. And it seems to me that such an entanglement joining home and people is at the heart of this conflict is almost impossible to unravel. This is particularly evident in disputes over territory and settlements, and also in the variety of punitive measures against houses and homes, such as demolitions, house sealing, confiscation, appropriation of property and occupation, as well as, on the other side, the firing of rockets into civilian areas in a similar way. So it seems that this is a problem of how to share not only a house, but also a commonly dangerously oppressive history, one as binding and as corrosive as nationality. So I like reading the work of Jacqueline Rose, and she wrote just a little sort of phrase which resonated, that ignorance and intimacy as opposite ends of the same pole. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that contact, or the house, is eminently suitable for the establishment of contact zones. But zones which avoid or counter to ignorance on the one hand, and also avoid the sort of close, deadly form of intimacy or proximity, as in this kind of case. And finally, the words of one, the Israeli writer, and Edward Said, the Palestinian writer, where David Grossman wrote about, in his books, he said, the arbitrariness of an external force that violently invades the life of one person, one soul, preoccupies me in almost all my books. And as Edward Said wrote, even though we are inside our world, there's no preventing others from getting in, overhearing us, decoding our private messages, violating our privacy. This is how we read the history of Palestine from the Crusades to Balfour and Weizmann. That it was entered despite us, lived in despite us. What do you do then? You try to get used to living alongside outsiders and endlessly attempting to define what is yours on the inside. Okay, thank you.
And one thing that struck me in a sense also with the question of the wound, because that was also how Christoph Wodischke sort of starts his discussion about interrogative design, that far too often designers just put band-aids on things, and we need to sort of, how do we address symptoms, and how do we sort of step back and look at the larger picture too. And I'm curious in a sense also, I mean, I'm stuck in this sort of prepositional mode in a sense, but there's something about, of course, the wound of does the doctor mobilize the immune defense? Is that sort of how recovery happens? Or is even sort of medical metaphors actually perhaps the wrong way to go, in the sense that when we talk about recovery, perhaps we think that things will be healed back to an earlier stage that will actually just never appear. So if I have addiction, I actually don't want to recover back to the trauma that produced my addiction, in the sense of I want to move on, in a sense. And perhaps that how does this kind of, how can designers help exactly rebuild bridges and things? What are these kind of curations that moves on, in a sense? It's just also another thing that before, sort of a question about also the for and with, in a sense. which is, I think, that's a little trauma for design from where I come, in a sense that it's always perhaps taken for granted that designers design for a certain consumer or so on, and designing with is a little trickier. But there's also something that, is there also a sort of a conflict there, in a sense that is it the rich that can afford? I don't want, my Rolls Royce is not going to be designed with me. My Jaguar is not going to be designed with me. The rich, the castles that I inherit or something, it's designed for me, in a sense. So I'm curious, in a sense, is there also what happens in this? Is there certain kind of groups of people that are just taken for granted that it's for them, and then is in the lack of empathy or something, we move in a sort of a gesture to design with, in order to cover up our inability to actually be empathetic in things. So is there trouble here of just in the repositionings that designers do that where the sensorial mechanisms, in a sense, do just not match any longer. But that's just something. But we can take that discussions over lunch. But I would want to open for the floor for questions. We were just talking for.
In all these instances, I didn't see where design was really a crucial thing that the speakers were, in the end, getting at. It was more about witnessing and figuring out our place in recognizing the really complex situations, the structural situations that we're finding ourselves in, wounded situations. So maybe as designers, we're going to step back a little bit to do a little bit of that kind of recognition work. And I like some of the terms that came up around witnessing, but I'm also uncomfortable with what gives us the privilege to witness, and how each of you are navigating in all of your works that really complex process of witnessing, relationship building, and being present in solidarity, which is probably the only thing we can consider doing, but even that requires a very conscious act, which is problematic. So just wanted to bring that to each of you to think about how you're navigating it.
I think in the situation we found ourselves in the camp, there was no designing for there. And going back to the analogy of the medical analogy of the wounded, we've been warned about kind of romanticising the camp, and we shouldn't. It shouldn't be there. It should never have happened. But it did. It was a space where we were welcomed and fed and looked after with open arms. So then you have to kind of ask firstly the question of who is sick, in particular in kind of relation to the UK and current politics there. So we're definitely not designing for the people in the camp. And I think actually there's a communication and a bridge that needs to kind of be built between the people in the camp and the people in the UK, because there's obviously a huge misunderstanding. So the design is not for the refugees in the camp. It's probably more for the 52% majority of the UK.
But also your act of being there, in the ways that you try to do.
Yeah.
Just someone who can try to help you reflect on that process.
We were there by accident almost. We didn't go there to make a film. We didn't go there to do a project, and actually it's just hideous to even consider that in terms of a project. We went there to be volunteers and repair shelters, work with people, and then wanted to kind of share an understanding of that space, a different kind of resolution to that space that's different to the media, which is a person looking at someone, something. These films are a first attempt at a co-authoring with people from the camp.
If I could respond a little bit, I think the use of the word design is a little tricky here. You could say design, you needn't be designing something for, but repurposing design artifacts. It could be reconsidering artifacts education design. So I think I think design, we often take for granted here a perspective. Barbara and I were talking about this earlier. That other, in other universities, other schools, other settings, design is very instrumental. And design here has at least, I'm not a designer, so I should probably shut my mouth right now and let you guys talk. But, how do you all think of design? You've opened up a really interesting space for a question here, I think.
And in my position also it's a little kind of hard for me to place where I will go and so on. And that's the reason, I came into this project by trying to think designerly, and what can I bring in unfolding or uncovering the relationships in that specific camp, or in kind of all the camps around Greece. We were talking earlier about the moment that these camps, they become objects of taxonomy. There is a specific taxonomy there, which we as designers, we are not trained to see things like that, or we are trained to see these things, but in a more visual way. I felt that what I said, it was visualized by your presentation somehow. It was a continuity. So we as designers, we have to bring our way of thinking, of analyzing, bringing some methods, putting a camera on the down part of the bicycle, and do this kind of bridging between the social sciences or politics and so on. So I think that I don't want to think that designers, we are gods, but we have this kind of ability to combine things, to be the glue in some cases, and it doesn't need to end up to finished products, to the pouch of above the scratch and so on. It can also just be the ability to bring these things together in layers.
I think what I took from all of the 4 papers was an aspect of sort of opening things up for scrutiny, for revealing, for trying to look at situations which might be hidden, might not be available. Now, I think as you sort of hinted, that does open up a question about the person who's doing it, what is their position, and so on. So I think that's an interesting question which I'm not sure I have time to answer at the moment for myself. I think it does open those questions, like who is the person that's doing the revealing and what are their motives and so on. Like that.
Yes, please. Thanks. I really like the first question, which was, and what also Susan followed up with this notion of whether actually we're talking about design in terms of real design. And it comes to me, coming from this activist design refugee field, a very interesting observation that since refugee sort of was a topic coming up in many presentations, that across Europe and not only Europe, but the experiences that those camps that were designed just by refugees, which are actually like Calais, like Jungle, or Idomeni, were actually, not many of you might know, they were actually pop-up camps, so they were not actually a formal entities. So it's sort of interesting because none of them actually exist anymore. So they were all shut down, and all of them were pop-up camps, and they were, in some cases, they were actually substituted with government camps or the UNHCR or international organizations producing something from rather top-bottom approach. And this is really interesting because on one hand, you see those camps, this organic movement that creates those sort of comfortable environment for people. But then there is this overarching, more durable design that comes and brings this power politics. And there's just one very interesting example that I think Barbara has mentioned, which is this idea of solidarity and with or for. And there is a great project which is Refugees Welcome, which is actually no design for the problem of housing refugees throughout the world, which is bringing the refugees to your own homes. And that is extremely interesting and sort of the paradox that you don't actually need a design to solve to produce that kind of solution.
But in a sense, you could argue that if we want to hang on to this word, and I'm not tied to it, design could go away if we did the right thing. Seriously. But you could argue that in inviting someone into your home, you are both designing a scenario, but as a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Jane Hunt, once said, design at some point has to involve some material. It doesn't have to be the outcome, but the process. So in that case, the process is the home that I'm sharing. So, yeah, I think that, what we name it is really interesting to a point to us, but I think all that matters is the experiences that people have.
Can I take one more question?
Yeah, you're teaching at Göteborg University?
Yes.
Yeah,
Or
well,
not teaching, but I'm
child's playing Göteborg. I've got a nice little moment for you. In 71, I was living in Göteborg with the National Swedish Theater Company. It sounds official, but it's like Bank of America. It's nothing to do with America. It was a socialist group that sent its theater to what you would call housing projects in Göteborg for poor Swedes and immigrants. I don't know what poor Swede is. They look up a middle class to me, but it's comparison. Right, what they did was they gave these kind of talks, playlets, where they're sort of showing kids how to play, what to do, how to improve your life, how to look at what the government's doing. A little brainwashing kind of thing. I thought that was very interesting and socialist. My idea of this play, I'm writing a book. I finished it. It's on the FDR in baseball. I show how baseball playing really saved America. 1895 is the first ball and bat that we see in Little Lord Fauntleroy. What did children do on their own before they were monitored? And this is the point I want to get at, monitoring child. Well, they took dogs, and they had the dogs fight. What did they do before that? George Washington's biography. They took cocks, and they had the cocks fight. Right? Nicaragua, it's still the number one sport in Nicaragua, cockfighting. Right, that's a little blood. What about Sacha Baron? Kazakhstan, what does he have the kids do on the street? Well, they torment the Jew, right? They harass them, right? They torture them, right? Right, we're thinking about, the east side of New York. What did they do? Well, they stole. Well, they're not stealing in the camps because there's nothing to steal, right? What did they do after that? That's the question. Lord of the Flies, Goldie, they sacrificed, bullied each other. So my thought is, I'm curious. I think that the issue really is it the responsibility of the power that is setting up these camps to monitor closely, like recess monitors in America for that playtime. Is that a part of it, or is it just free for all, let the kids do what they want? I couldn't quite find it.
There is no specific plan. I mean, there is from governmental their intervention with children stops in the educational program that offer. Then there are the NGOs that they take part of, keeping them busy and doing things like that. So the in-between is the photos I saw before with the kids climbing up on the tents, going around, playing free within the boundaries of that, or if they are lucky enough to have some money from the United Nations and their parents are willing to do that, going downtown to play in some playgrounds or being, into the urban kind of situation. So there is no specific plan or activities from above in that sense. So everything is left to NGOs basically, or people with as volunteer people or groups of solidarity and so on. So
we have time for one last question. And then I'm as the officious timekeeper. I've got Susanna Draper, who's kind enough to come back. You had a question?
Yeah, I was thinking as I was putting all these, like how the question of making home what form can it take in these situations, where what we see is a radical homelessness, and then a question of the temporality of these processes, where it is to inhabit a kind of like absolute present, because the sense of futurity is really difficult, and how do we talk about making home and we have like the military in the bathroom, the living room,
We're talking about the unmaking of home in that case.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this conference is not about necessarily just making home. I mean, every one of you have made home in your seat. You nested for a second.
Yeah.
But you all have the security of walking back or going back somewhere else. I think you're right to point out the uncertainty, but I do think we're not just talking about the making, we're talking about the unmaking.
Yeah.
And with that, we're doing really well. I want to thank everyone here. You were fantastic.